Alright, this is episode 2 of the Application of Modern Philosophy, a series dedicated towards exploring philosophical texts from this century and the last, and applying their thematic elements for practitioners today, and to use their thematic elements to understand the modern context and the academic context of the modern day. Now, the texts that I explore aren't always strictly philosophical. For example, today's episode is on Will Durant's History of Civilization, Volume 1, Our Oriental Heritage, and I'm focusing strictly on Chapter 1, a small, passage from Chapter 1 that I think, in my opinion, is one of the most important texts for any historian, or anyone interested in exploring the historical narrative that has led to our states today. Now, Will Durant, his writing style is very unique. Now, he is a historian, right? He is a historian, and he's focused with not telling facts, because history is not factual all the time, but in finding correlations and in finding adequate explanations for how things came to be, right? That's what history really is. It's not about informing factual information, but it's about discovering certain links and connections that help us evaluate and understand the constructs that we use and the constructs that are around us. Now, that being said, Will Durant is still very informative, right? He takes on a persuasive voice, so he's interested in sending a message as much as he is in educating the readers, right? And that's something I don't personally see in thinkers today and lectures, is that they're so focused on informing, right? Will Durant's Chapter 1, called The Conditions of Civilization, is probably one of my favorite pieces of literature. He is very careful in being unbiased. Yet, although unbiased, he's not afraid of giving credit to the civilizations and to the people, the races actually, that promoted development, and that promoted advancement, even despite the collateral that was unfortunately a product of expansion. Right, so I put the quote in the description. It's a long quote, so I'm not going to read it. I will reference it throughout this video. But you can pause the video, read the quote, and it's a little dated, but it's not inaccessible. It's still very readable for the modern reader. In this quote, in this chapter really, but in this quote, Will Durant is concerned with explaining the 4 major conditions of any civilization, right? So this chapter is concerned with elaborating on what these 4 conditions are and how, most importantly, work together in constituting a civilization. Something he misses, though, not misses, but something he looks over or underplays. He does mention education, but he underplays the role of education. I don't know why. He seems to be aware of it, but he doesn't spend a whole amount of time exploring the influence that education has on constituting the conditions of civilization. And that's what this video is about. It's not just about exploring the historical narrative. It's about finding a link between education and the 4 conditions of civilization as stated by Will Durant. So what are the four conditions? I've separated them into two categories. The first two categories are what I consider, or not me, what Will Durant considers prerequisites of civilization, right? Prerequisites. One is the geological condition, the state of the earth, the livability, right? The second is geographical, location. Do the people have access to water? Irrigation, right? Is there an appropriate balance between climates? Is it too hot, like the tropics? Is it too cold to sustain life? There's a difference between geological and geographical. Geological refers to the health of the earth, right, of the location, the health of the location. Even if there is no civilization, is this location sustainable? Does it sustain human life? Geographical, although sustainable, although it is able to sustain, can it enable civilization, right? So there's similar concepts, similar conditions, but very important distinctions, because a place could be very well, right? It could sustain people very well, but it may not have the products required to, for example, irrigation, right? Right? So these are the two prerequisites. Is this location prone to earthquakes, right? Tectonic movements, volcanoes, right? Is this location appropriate for irrigation, right? Does it have a sufficient food supply, right? Is it possible to nurture a food supply, etc.? The two prerequisites, geological condition and the geographical conditions. Now we go into the second category, right? These two conditions are more abstract. This is once, these conditions come to light after the prerequisites have been met. That's why they're called prerequisites. I've categorized these conditions, the following conditions, under a psychosocial category, right? They are, as I've said, they're a little bit more abstract. They're not so concerned with the physical as much as they are with the mental and the interpersonal. Okay? First category is economic, the economic condition of civilization, which basically refers to sustainability, not survival sustainability, right? Not food sustainability, but trade sustainability. Sorry, I need to correct myself. What the economic condition refers to is preservation, right? Sustainability can refer to whether or not there is an appropriate food supply, right? That is the geographical condition. The economic condition is not only concerned with the sustainability of a food supply, but of the preservation of the food supply, right? And that's why I mentioned trade. I got a little confused, but right. So once the peoples are able to preserve the food supply, as in find a way to not have to hunt or gather every day, but find a system that holds a surplus of resources, in this example, food, right? Whether that is by trading, whether that is by growing, whether that is by creating a system of barter and what is that called? Just when systems come into play to enable preservation of resources, that is when an economic condition has been met, right? Because the idea of preservation, the idea of sustainability is at play. That the peoples are thinking about holding on to something for future use rather than being impulsive every day and rediscovering methods every day. The fourth condition is the final step in constructing civilization, right? And that is called the political. It's perhaps the most abstract condition out of all of them. And it's the final step in recognizing when a civilization crosses over from being a village, a tribe, a society, a culture, into something like civilization or urbanization. Right? Will Durant actually in the quote says, culture may suggest agriculture, but civilization suggests the city, right? So although there are groups of people that have a very well-developed culture, the distinction between them and a civilization can be found in their order or in their political creation, right? In the political condition. Now, the political condition does not refer to politics, right? It can be divided into subcategories such as language, law, and most importantly, education. In fact, I would consider education to be an umbrella term for most of these conditions. But Will Durant categorizes education under the political condition, right? The main meaning, the heart, the core of this condition is order. When order comes into play, right? When the people start abiding by some sort of order or bring order to their daily rituals, either by delegation or government or a system of chance, whatever. I'm not so knowledgeable on this aspect, but that is basically when you can recognize a political condition being met. Now keep in mind, I have quickly and not so well summarized the four conditions, but I wanted to give the viewers a small understanding at least of what the four conditions are. So I would recommend reading the text if you want to get a better grasp at what these four conditions are. Right? Okay. So now these four conditions have been met. A group of peoples throughout the hundreds of years have developed each condition and can adequately call themselves civilization. We've seen this happen in the early days where certain cities, you could call them, had established themselves and began living as one collective community that were not only concerned with survival but preservation, right? What happens naturally, subconsciously really, is development, right? It's obvious. An increasing standard of life, right? Every new civilization aspires to a greater standard of life than previous civilizations. It's not because they want to, it's because they have to, right? Think about it. The more you learn about irrigation, the better you get at it. What that does is it now presses on the geographical conditions. Where once irrigation required a small field, a few people, and very minimal effort, now requires, as the population grows and as people require more from the irrigation, the geographical location, the geographical condition is being pressed, right? It's being pressured beyond what it may be capable of, right? So now you see a necessity to expand, or a necessity to relocate, perhaps, right? As the population increases, as the people desire more resources, whatever it may be, the geological and the geographical conditions are now being pressed beyond what they may be capable of producing for the people, right? Right now, this isn't a bad thing. It's not that people are misusing their environment. It's that they are, in fact, learning from it and growing from it. They're strengthening what we know now to be the human identity. This is the precursor to the transference of civilization. And what I mean by that is, this is when you begin to see more and more civilizations slowly develop, right? Because now it is a necessity to move, to find greater land, to find more nurturing environments, more appropriate climates, more space, something as simple as that, right? Right, and this is essentially an example of development. This is what it means to develop, right? You require more from your environment than it can give you. And now it also arises another interesting concept, competition. Now that we do have a number of civilizations, no matter how small, the concept of competition comes to mind, right? When one civilization compares itself to another, or compares their environment to another environment, they realize what they are missing and what they are holding. They realize their strengths and their weaknesses, etc., right? And although it may seem negative, it may sound negative, it is actually an extremely beneficial relationship that these civilizations have with one another. This competition, like any really competition that we even see today, benefits the production of advancements, right? One civilization focuses its attention on outperforming the other civilization. What happens when these civilizations meet is transference, right? So now you've seen civilizations educating themselves, right? I skipped over that part, but these civilizations practice what is education, right? They teach their communities not only how to survive, not only how to preserve, but how to compete, right? They are developing a foundation for future generations. They're outperforming other civilizations to preserve their way of life, right? Now, all of this is obvious, right? This is something that we're taught in school. Cultural diffusion, all of that. But what people usually overlook is the influence that a previous civilization may have on a future civilization that transcends the people. Now, what I mean by that is, sorry, I was getting a little distracted, but the point I'm trying to make is that the foundation of one civilization was built on the education of previous civilizations, right? No one civilization is responsible for its holistic development. It's more of a componential process, right? And when you relate that to the previous idea that I was talking about with development, right? Once a civilization is sustained, there begins development. and the conditions are pressed upon, right? As these conditions become pressed upon, it increases the standard of life, and that's related to the concept of why every new civilization is more advanced than previous civilizations. It's not because of the race, which I will get into in a little bit. It's not because of the people in that civilization, right? It's because of the foundations of civilization as a whole. What it means to be a civilization changes as more and more civilizations come to life. Our idea of civilization today is completely different than civilizations even during the Romans and the Greeks and whatever, right? It's a different standard of life, and some may consider it to be a higher standard of life, whereas others may not. It is most likely a higher standard of life. Now, I want to give some examples, right? So you have medicine, right? The discipline of medicine. One civilization which overwhelmingly influenced the medicinal discipline for almost every other following civilization was ancient China, right? You have which is, although it's considered pseudoscientific, you have traditional Chinese medicine, which was, in a lot of ways, leading the medicinal world at that time, the medicinal sciences, right? You had books like the Inner Canon of the Yellow Emperor, right, which is, for centuries, the most influential book of medicine. Right? Although the Chinese civilization was thriving medicinally because of this knowledge, other civilizations were able to use that one book upon transference and implement those implement that knowledge towards their own development, right? So they didn't establish themselves as doctors, as intellectuals of the medical field. They used existing information, such as the Inner Canon of the Yellow Emperor, to build their own world, their own field. Right? We see this with Greek philosophy, which essentially was the foundation of discipline. Now, what I mean by discipline is field, right? So you had it was one of the first times you saw a specific dedication to either one thought process or another, right? So you had interests. People were delegating themselves towards what they found to be intellectually stimulating, right? That was a big influence by the Greek philosophy. The best example that I can give, because I am most familiar with it, is the example of Al-Hasan, or Ibn al-Haytham, who is considered to be the father of modern optics. Right? The reason he's so important for this discussion is because he predated the European Renaissance. Right? He existed during the time of the medieval period. For those who aren't aware, during that period, Europe was in shambles, was suffering, was in the lowest point it had ever been, and it was considered the land of savages. The Islamic Empire, on the other hand, in the East, was thriving, was living and advancing, developing. Right? It was most strongly exercising the four conditions of civilization. Right? And there was a lot of intellectual developments that came out from that empire, from that period of time, that later influenced the civilizations of the West. Similar to how previous civilizations had influenced the Islamic Empire. Right? So the Islamic Empire did not naturally grow from the deserts. It used existing foundations of education and knowledge to advance itself. Al-Hasan was one of the products of the Islamic Empire, of the civilization, right? He's considered the father of modern optics because he was one of the first thinkers to explore the relationship between light and vision, how light reflects with the eyes, right? And what he also wrote was a book called Kitab al-Manazir. Now this book was greatly influential towards algebraic thought. The Renaissance occurred when a group of individuals refound education, right? The Enlightenment era. Right. So you had the Renaissance, which was a sort of which was basically a period of rediscovery of ancient knowledge, as well as the influence of new knowledge. One of those new knowledges was from Al-Hasan and his books on optics and his interest in algebra, which kickstarted the artistic movement in the West. Right. Now it wasn't a direct cause and effect, but it was very indirectly influential for artists rediscovering that ability to construct or reconstruct our environments on a page through algebraic expressions. Right? So you begin to see a new civilization finding themselves. Now that the West was able to satisfy the prerequisite conditions, because the West has always been a fairly nourished land, the prerequisites were never really an issue. It was more of an issue of sustaining a political and an economical condition, right? So once the Eastern civilizations were able to transfer their knowledge and their information, the West was able to utilize it to the best of their abilities and rebuild themselves. Right? You had something like the British Empire come to be, which was one of the greatest civilizations in the world. Now, it wasn't because they were British, right? It was because it was a very well-established civilization. Now, this is where I wanted to get into eugenics, and I wanted to actually maintain the focus of this discussion on eugenics and how we can use eugenics to track the historical narrative of civilization, but I'm not ready for that. I still have to do more research and find a level of confidence to speak on eugenics because of how controversial subject it is and how risky it is to really try and present eugenics as a valuable source of information. Right? But what I do want to focus on is I want to touch on the idea of eugenics. Why it's so controversial? Because Will Durant actually mentions it too, and I'll go back to the quote. He says, "There are no racial conditions to civilization." Right? And then he says it may appear on any continent in any color, and he mentions a list of different civilizations that existed all over the world. Right? And then he says, it is the great civilization that makes the people. It is not the great race that makes the civilization. He says the Englishman does not make British civilization, it makes him. If he carries it with him wherever he goes and dresses for dinner at Timbuktu, it is not because he is creating his civilization there anew, but that he acknowledges even there its mastery over his soul. Right? Al-Hasan didn't influence the West in the way of recreating the Islamic Empire, right? His influence, his knowledge, and his contributions to the artistic world kick-started a civilization of its own. The West did not become a Muslim civilization, right? Because the knowledge that they were using was not because of its Muslim core, although it was nurtured by the Muslim empire, right? It was not inherently Muslim. It was intellectual more so. Right? So when we think about the British Empire similarly, and we controversially talk about the British Empire, a mistake that I see people often making is they are afraid to give credit to the civilization, such as the British Empire. They're afraid to give credit to any great civilization, right? Because unfortunately, there is the dilemma of holding the superiority of one civilization in high regard and minimizing the tragedy and the collateral that was a result of their superiority. Right? But we have to remember this is a naturally occurring phenomenon, and it's never going to change. If there is one powerful civilization, there's always going to be tragedy. It's unavoidable, it's unfair, right? But it's from that tragedy that the roots of future civility is born, right? It's more of a dilemma of appreciating the sacrifice and the collateral. Is it worth the great consequence, right? That is really the issue that, the question that is plaguing all of us today. Right? It's an idea of homogeneity. Are these civilizations so concerned with spreading knowledge, right, sharing their knowledge, or are they concerned with a tendency for homogeneity, right? Which is ironic, because the more you try and hold on to this eugenic preservation of a race, right, such as the British Empire, who thought, you know what, let's spread our empire to the rest of the world, let's recreate the British Empire elsewhere. The more they did that, the more they influenced the production of future civilizations, right? The more they try to hold on to the British Empire in other parts of the world, right? The more they influenced back the rebellion, the more they influenced opposition. They created opposition as a result of this eugenic ideology. And they're not the only at fault. This is the case with every civilization. Every great civilization has a eugenic tendency for homogeneity. And it's ironic, because it's the very cause for creating opposition and competition in other civilizations, because a natural transference of knowledge occurs, right? I would not be here without the British Empire colonizing India, right? Now, I'm not a British person. I don't consider myself British at all. But I'm using the foundations of their civility mixed with the ancient foundations of Indus civility, and I am a completely new product of civilization. Right? And all of us hold these sorts of qualities that are born from the transference of one civilization to another. So when we approach the idea of something like colonialism, it's very important to acknowledge the power of these civilizations. And equally important to make a distinction between the great race, which there is no such thing, and the great civilization, which makes the race, right? As Will Durant says in the chapter. Now, next episode, I'm going to try and focus on the eugenic tendency that I touched upon here, right? The tendency to want to recreate your race elsewhere, how that influences opposition and how that influences competition, and ultimately a revival of civilization or a creation of civilization elsewhere. But that is it for this episode. And again, this is still early in my career in making these videos, so it's not the most fluid or the most coherent thing yet. But I hope it was still worthwhile. Thank you.